Unit 731, short for Manshu Detachment 731 and also known as the Kamo Detachment, 198 and Ishii Unit, was a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that engaged in lethal human experimentation and biological weapons manufacturing during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. It was based in the Pingfang district of Harbin, the largest city in the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, and had active branch offices throughout China and Southeast Asia. Unit 731 was responsible for some of the most notorious war crimes committed by the Japanese armed forces. It routinely conducted tests on humans who were dehumanized and internally referred to as logs. Experiments included disease injections, controlled dehydration, hypobaric chamber experiments, biological weapons testing, vivisection, amputation, and standard weapons testing. Victims included not only kidnapped men, women, and children, but also babies born from the systemic rape perpetrated by the staff inside the compound. The victims came from different nationalities, with the majority being Chinese and a significant minority being Russian. Additionally, Unit 731 produced biological weapons that were used in areas of China not occupied by Japanese forces, which included Chinese cities and towns, water sources, and fields. Estimates of those killed by Unit 731 and its related programs range up to 500,000 people, and none of the inmates survived. It was officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Guangdong Army. Originally set up by the Kenpeitai military police of the Empire of Japan, Unit 731 was taken over and commanded until the end of the war by General Ishii Ishii, a combat medic officer in the Guangdong Army. The facility itself was built in 1935 as a replacement for the Zongma Fortress, and Ishii and his team used it to expand their capabilities. The program received generous support from the Japanese government until the end of the war in 1945. Unit 731 and the other units of the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department operated biological weapon production, testing, deployment, and storage facilities. While Unit 731 researchers arrested by Soviet forces were tried at the December 1949 Khabarovsk war crime trials, those captured by the United States were secretly given immunity in exchange for the data gathered during their human experiments. The United States covered up the human experimentations and handed stipends to the perpetrators. The Americans co-opted the researchers' bioweapons information and experience for use in their own biological warfare program, much like what had been done with German researchers in Operation Paperclip. Formation. Japan started their biological weapons program in the 1930s, partly because biological weapons were banned by the Geneva Convention of 1925, they reasoned that the ban verified its effectiveness as a weapon. Japan's occupation of Manchuria began in 1931 after the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Japan decided to build Unit 731 in Manchuria because the occupation not only gave the Japanese an advantage of separating the research station from their island, but also gave them access to as many Chinese individuals as they wanted for use as human experimental subjects. They viewed the Chinese as no-cost research subjects, and hoped that they could use this advantage to lead the world in biological warfare. The majority of research subjects were Chinese, but many were of different nationalities. In 1932, Surgeon General Ishii Ishii, Chief Medical Officer of the Imperial Japanese Army and protege of Army Minister Sadao Araki, was placed in command of the Army Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory. Ishii organized a secret research group, the TG Unit, for chemical and biological experimentation in Manchuria. Ishii had proposed the creation of a Japanese biological and chemical research unit in 1930, after a 2-year study trip abroad, on the grounds that Western powers were developing their own programs. One of Ishii's main supporters inside the army was Colonel Chikahiko Koizumi, who later served as Japan's health minister from 1941 to 1945. Koizumi had joined a secret poison gas research committee in 1915, during World War I, when he and other Imperial Japanese Army officers were impressed by the successful German use of chlorine gas at the Second Battle of Ypres, in which the Allies suffered 5,000 deaths and 15,000 wounded as a result of the chemical attack. Zongma Fortress. Unit TG was set into motion in the Zongma Fortress, a prison/experimentation camp in Baiyanhe, a village 100 kilometers south of Harbin on the South Manchuria Railway. Prisoners were generally well fed on a diet of rice or wheat, meat, fish, and occasionally even alcohol in order to be in normal health at the beginning of experiments. Then, over several days, prisoners were eventually drained of blood and deprived of nutrients and water. Their deteriorating health was recorded. Some were also vivisected. Others were deliberately infected with plague bacteria and other microbes. A prison break in the autumn of 1934, which jeopardized the facility's secrecy, and an explosion in 1935 led Ishii to shut down Zongma Fortress. He then received authorization to move to Pingfang, approximately 24 kilometers south of Harbin, to set up a new, much larger facility. Unit 731. In 1936, Emperor Hirohito issued a decree authorizing the expansion of the unit and its integration into the Guangdong Army as the Epidemic Prevention Department. It was divided at that time into the Ishii Unit and Wakamatsu Unit, with a base in Hsin. From August 1940 on, the units were known collectively as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Guangdong Army, or Unit 731 for short. His younger brother, Prince Mikasa, toured the Unit 731 headquarters in China, and wrote in his memoir that he watched films showing how Chinese prisoners were made to march on the plains of Manchuria for poison gas experiments on humans. Other units. In addition to the establishment of Unit 731, the decree also called for the creation of an additional biological warfare development unit, called the Guangdong Army Military Horse Epidemic Prevention Workshop, and a chemical warfare development unit called the Guangdong Army Technical Testing Department. After the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, sister chemical and biological warfare units were founded in major Chinese cities and were referred to as epidemic prevention and water supply units. Detachments included Unit 1855 in Beijing, Unit EI 1644 in Nanjing, Unit 8604 in Guangzhou, and later Unit 9420 in Singapore. All of these units comprised Ishii's network, which, at its height in 1939, oversaw over 10,000 personnel. Medical doctors and professors from Japan were attracted to join Unit 731 both by the rare opportunity to conduct human experimentation and the Army's strong financial backing. Experiments. A special project, codenamed Merida, used human beings for experiments. Test subjects were gathered from the surrounding population and sometimes euphemistically referred to as logs, used in such contexts as how many logs fell. This term originated as a joke on the part of the staff because the official cover story for the facility given to local authorities was that it was a lumber mill. However, according to a junior uniformed civilian employee of the Imperial Japanese Army working in Unit 731, the project was internally called Holzklotz, German for log. In a further parallel, the corpses of sacrificed subjects were disposed of by incineration. Researchers in Unit 731 also published some of their results in peer-reviewed journals, writing as though the research had been conducted on non-human primates called Manchurian monkeys or long-tailed monkeys. According to American historian Sheldon H. Harris, the Togo unit employed gruesome tactics to secure specimens of select body organs. If Ishii or one of his co-workers wished to do research on the human brain, then they would order the guards to find them a useful sample. A prisoner would be taken from his cell. Guards would hold him while another guard would smash the victim's head open with an axe. His brain would be extracted off to the pathologist, and then to the crematorium for the usual disposal. Nakagawa Yonzo, professor emeritus at Osaka University, studied at Kyoto University during the war. While he was there, he watched footage of human experiments and executions from Unit 731. He later testified about the playfulness of the experimenters. Some of the experiments had nothing to do with advancing the capability of germ warfare, or of medicine. There is such a thing as professional curiosity. What would happen if we did such and such? What medical purpose was served by performing and studying beheadings? None at all. That was just playing around. Professional people, too, like to play. Prisoners were injected with diseases, disguised as vaccinations, to study their effects. To study the effects of untreated venereal diseases, male and female prisoners were deliberately infected with syphilis and gonorrhea, then studied. Prisoners were also repeatedly subjected to rape by guards. Vivisection. Thousands of men, women, children, and infants interned at prisoner of war camps were subjected to vivisection, often performed without anesthesia and usually lethal. In a video interview, former Unit 731 member Okawa Fukumatsu admitted to having vivisected a pregnant woman. Vivisections were performed on prisoners after infecting them with various diseases. Researchers performed invasive surgery on prisoners, removing organs to study the effects of disease on the human body. Prisoners had limbs amputated in order to study blood loss. Limbs removed were sometimes reattached to the opposite side of victims' bodies. Some prisoners had their stomachs surgically removed and their esophagus reattached to the intestines. Parts of organs, such as the brain, lungs, and liver, were removed from others. Imperial Japanese Army surgeon Ken Yuasa suggests that practicing vivisection on human subjects was widespread even outside Unit 731, estimating that at least 1,000 Japanese personnel were involved in the practice in mainland China. Biological warfare. Unit 731 and its affiliated units were involved in research, development, and experimental deployment of epidemic-creating biowarfare weapons in assaults against the Chinese populace throughout World War II. Plague-infected fleas, bred in the laboratories of Unit 731 and Unit 1644, were spread by low-flying airplanes over Chinese cities, including coastal Ningbo and Chengde, Hunan Province, in 1940 and 1941. These operations killed tens of thousands with bubonic plague epidemics. An expedition to Nanjing involved spreading typhoid and paratyphoid germs into the wells, marshes, and houses of the city, as well as infusing them in snacks distributed to locals. Epidemics broke out shortly after, to the elation of many researchers, who concluded that paratyphoid fever was the most effective of the pathogens. 173 At least 12 large-scale bioweapon field trials were carried out, and at least 11 Chinese cities attacked with biological agents. An attack on Chengde in 1941 reportedly led to approximately 10,000 biological casualties and 1,700 deaths among ill-prepared Japanese troops, in most cases due to cholera. Japanese researchers performed tests on prisoners with bubonic plague, cholera, smallpox, botulism, and other diseases. This research led to the development of the defoliation bacilli bomb and the flea bomb used to spread bubonic plague. Some of these bombs were designed with porcelain shells, an idea proposed by Ishii in 1938. These bombs enabled Japanese soldiers to launch biological attacks, infecting agriculture, reservoirs, wells, as well as other areas, with anthrax and plague carrier fleas, typhoid, cholera, or other deadly pathogens. During biological bomb experiments, researchers dressed in protective suits would examine the dying victims. Infected food supplies and clothing were dropped by airplane into areas of China not occupied by Japanese forces. In addition, poisoned food and candy were given to unsuspecting victims. Plague fleas, infected clothing, and infected supplies encased in bombs were dropped on various targets. The resulting cholera, anthrax, and plague were estimated to have killed at least 400,000 Chinese civilians. Tularemia was also tested on Chinese civilians. Due to pressure from numerous accounts of the biowarfare attacks, Chiang Kai-shek sent a delegation of army and foreign medical personnel in November 1941 to document evidence and treat the afflicted. A report on the Japanese use of plague-infected fleas on Changde was made widely available the following year but was not addressed by the Allied powers until Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a public warning in 1943 condemning the attacks. During the final months of World War II, codenamed Cherry Blossoms at Night, the plan of Unit 731 was to use kamikaze pilots to infest San Diego, California, with the plague. The plan was scheduled to launch on September 22, 1945, but Japan surrendered 5 weeks earlier. Weapons testing. Human targets were used to test grenades positioned at various distances and in various positions. Flamethrowers were tested on people. Victims were also tied to stakes and used as targets to test pathogen-releasing bombs, chemical weapons, shrapnel bombs with varying amounts of fragments, and explosive bombs as well as bayonets and knives. To determine the best course of treatment for varying degrees of shrapnel wounds sustained on the field by Japanese soldiers, Chinese prisoners were exposed to direct bomb blasts. They were strapped, unprotected, to wooden planks that were staked into the ground at increasing distances around a bomb that was then detonated. It was surgery for most, autopsies for the rest. Other experiments. In other tests, subjects were deprived of food and water to determine the length of time until death, placed into low-pressure chambers until their eyes popped from the sockets, experimented upon to determine the relationship between temperature, burns, and human survival, hung upside down until death, crushed with heavy objects, electrocuted, dehydrated with hot fans, placed into centrifuges and spun until death, injected with animal blood, notably with horse blood, exposed to lethal doses of X-rays, subjected to various chemical weapons inside gas chambers, injected with seawater, and burned or buried alive. In addition to chemical agents, the properties of many different toxins were also investigated by the unit. To name a few, prisoners were exposed to tetrodotoxin, heroin, Korean bindweed, Bactol, and castor oil seeds. Massive amounts of blood were drained from some prisoners in order to study the effects of blood loss according to former Unit 731 vivisectionist Okawa Fukumatsu. In one case, at least half a liter of blood was drawn at 2 to 3 day intervals. As stated above, dehydration experiments were performed on the victims. The purpose of these tests was to determine the amount of water in an individual's body and to see how long one could survive with a very low to no water intake. It is known that victims were also starved before these tests began. The deteriorating physical states of these victims were documented by staff at a periodic interval. It was said that a small number of these poor men, women, and children who became maritas were also mummified alive in total dehydration experiments. They sweated themselves to death under the heat of several hot dry fans. At death, the corpses would only weigh 1/5 normal body weight. Unit 731 also performed transfusion experiments with different blood types. Unit member Nao Ikeda wrote, "In my experience, when A-type blood 100 cubic centimeters was transfused to an O-type subject, whose pulse was 87 per minute and temperature was 35.4 degrees C, 30 minutes later the temperature rose to 38.6 degrees with slight trepidation. 60 minutes later the pulse was 106 per minute and the temperature was 39.4 degrees. 2 hours later the temperature was 37.7 degrees, and 3 hours later the subject recovered. When AB-type blood 120 cubic centimeters was transfused to an O-type subject, an hour later the subject described malaise and psychrosthesia in both legs. When AB-type blood 100 cubic centimeters was transfused to a B-type subject, there seemed to be no side effect. Unit 731 tested many different chemical agents on prisoners and had a building dedicated to gas experiments. Some of the agents tested were mustard gas, lewisite, cyanic acid gas, white phosphorus, adamsite, and phosgene gas. A former Army major and technician gave the following testimony anonymously. In 1943, I attended a poison gas test held at the Unit 731 test facilities. A glass-walled chamber about 3 meters square and 2 meters high was used. Inside of it, a Chinese man was blindfolded, with his hands tied around a post behind him. The gas was adamsite, and as the gas filled the chamber the man went into violent coughing convulsions and began to suffer excruciating pain. More than 10 doctors and technicians were present. After I had watched for about 10 minutes, I could not stand it anymore, and left the area. I understand that other types of gases were also tested there. Takeo Ueno, a former medical worker in Unit 731, said that he saw a Western man, who was vertically cut into 2 pieces, pickled in a jar of formaldehyde. Ueno guessed that the man was Russian because there were many Russians living in the area at that time. Unit 100 also experimented with toxic gas. Phone booth-like tanks were used as portable gas chambers for the prisoners. Some were forced to wear various types of gas masks, others wore military uniforms, and some wore no clothes at all. Some of the tests have been described as psychopathically sadistic, with no conceivable military application. For example, one experiment documented the time it took for 3-day-old babies to freeze to death. Unit 731 also tested chemical weapons on prisoners in field conditions. A report authored by unknown researcher in the Kamo unit describes a large human experiment of eperite gas on 7-10 September 1940. 20 subjects were divided into 3 groups and placed in combat emplacements, trenches, gazebos, and observatories. One group was clothed with Chinese underwear, no hat and no mask, and was subjected to as much as 1,800 field gun rounds of eperite gas over 25 minutes. Another group was clothed in summer military uniform and shoes, 3 had masks and another 3 had no mask. They also were exposed to as much as 1,800 rounds of eperite gas. A third group was clothed in summer military uniform, 3 with masks and 2 without masks, and were exposed to as much as 4,800 rounds. Then their general symptoms and damage to skin, eye, respiratory organs, and digestive organs were observed at 4 hours, 24 hours, and 2, 3, and 5 days after the shots. Injecting the blister fluid from one subject into another subject and analyses of blood and soil were also performed. 5 subjects were forced to drink a solution of eperite and lewisite gas in water, with or without decontamination. The report describes conditions of every subject precisely without mentioning what happened to them in the long run. The following is an excerpt of one of these reports. Number 376. Dug out of the first area. September 7, 1940, 6 p.m., tired and exhausted. Looks with hollow eyes. Weeping redness of the skin of the upper part of the body. Eyelids edematous, swollen. Epiphora. Hyperemic conjunctiva. September 8, 1940, 6 a.m., neck, breast, upper abdomen, and scrotum weeping. Reddened, swollen. Covered with millet seed-size to bean-size blisters. Eyelids and conjunctivae hyperemic and edematous. Had difficulties opening the eyes. September 8, 6 p.m., tired and exhausted. Feels sick. Body temperature 37 degrees Celsius. Mucus and blood erosions across the shoulder girdle. Abundant mucous nose secretions. Abdominal pain. Mucus and bloody diarrhea. Proteinuria. September 9, 1940, 7 a.m., tired and exhausted. Weakness of all four extreme ties. Low morale. Body temperature 37 degrees Celsius. Skin of the face still weeping. Frostbite testing. Syphilis. Rape and forced pregnancy. Prisoners and victims. In 2002, Chengde, China, site of the plague flea bombing, held an international symposium on the crimes of bacteriological warfare, which estimated that the number of people slaughtered by the Imperial Japanese Army germ warfare and other human experiments was around 580,000, 173. The American historian Sheldon H. Harris states that over 200,000 died. In addition to Chinese casualties, 1,700 Japanese troops in Zhejiang during Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign were killed by their own biological weapons while attempting to unleash the biological agent, indicating serious issues with distribution. Harris also said plague-infected animals were released near the end of the war, and caused plague outbreaks that killed at least 30,000 people in the Harbin area from 1946 to 1948. Some test subjects were selected to gather a wide cross-section of the population and included common criminals, captured bandits, anti-Japanese partisans, political prisoners, homeless and mentally disabled people, which included infants, men, the elderly and pregnant women, as well as those rounded up by the Kenpi Thai military police for alleged suspicious activities. Unit 731 staff included approximately 300 researchers, including doctors and bacteriologists. At least 3,000 men, women, and children, 117 from which at least 600 every year were provided by the Kenpi Thai, were subjected to Unit 731 experimentation conducted at the Ping Fang camp alone, not including victims from other medical experimentation sites such as Unit 100. Although 3,000 internal victims is the widely accepted figure in the literature, former unit member Okawa Fukumatsu refuted it in a video interview. He stated that there were at least over 10,000 victims of internal experiments at the unit and that he himself vivisected thousands. According to A.S. Wells, the majority of victims were Chinese, with a lesser percentage being Russian, Mongolian, and Korean. They may also have included a small number of European, American, Indian, Australian, and New Zealander prisoners of war. A member of the Yakuzen Sonandan paramilitary political youth branch, who worked for Unit 731, stated that not only were Chinese, Russians, and Koreans present, but also Americans, British, and French people. Sheldon H. Harris documented that the victims were generally political dissidents, communist sympathizers, ordinary criminals, impoverished civilians, and the mentally disabled. Author Seiichi Morimura estimates that almost 70% of the victims who died in the Ping Fang camp were Chinese, while close to 30% of the victims were Russian. No one who entered Unit 731 came out alive. Prisoners were usually received into Unit 731 at night in motor vehicles painted black with a ventilation hole but no windows. The vehicle would pull up at the main gates and one of the drivers would go to the guardroom and report to the guard. That guard would then telephone to the special team in the inner prison. Then, the prisoners would be transported through a secret tunnel dug under the facade of the central building to the inner prisons. One of the prisons housed women and children, while the other prison housed men. Once at the inner prison, technicians would take samples of the prisoners' blood and stool, test their kidney function, and collect other physical data. Once deemed healthy and fit for experimentation, prisoners lost their names and were given a 3-digit number, which they retained until their death. Whenever prisoners died after the experiments they had been subjected to, a clerk of the 1st Division struck their numbers off an index card and took the deceased prisoners' manacles to be put on new arrivals to the prison. There is at least one recorded instance of friendly social interaction between prisoners and Unit 731 staff. Technician Naokata Ishibashi interacted with 2 female prisoners. One prisoner was a 21-year-old Chinese woman, the other a Soviet girl who was 19 years of age. Ishibashi asked where she came from and learned that she was from Ukraine. The 2 prisoners told Ishibashi that they had not seen their faces in a mirror since being captured and begged him to get one. Ishibashi sneaked a mirror to them through a hole in the cell door. Prisoners were repeatedly reused for experiments as long as they were healthy enough. The average life expectancy of a prisoner once they had entered the unit was 2 months. Some prisoners were alive in the unit for over 12 months, and many female prisoners gave birth in the unit. The prison cells had wooden floors and a squat toilet in each. There was space between the outer walls of the cells and the outer walls of the prison, enabling the guards to walk behind the cells. Each cell door had a small window in it. Chief of the Personnel Division of the Guangdong Army Headquarters Tamura Tadashi testified that, when he was shown the inner prison, he looked into the cells and saw living people in chains. Some moved around, others were lying on the bare floor and were in a very sick and helpless condition. Former Unit 731 Youth Corps member Yoshio Shinozuka testified that the windows in these prison doors were so small that it was difficult to see in. The inner prison was a highly secured building complete with cast iron doors. No one could enter without special permits and an ID pass with a photograph, and the entry/exit times were recorded. The special team worked in these 2 inner prison buildings. This team wore white overall suits, army hats, rubber boots, and pistols strapped to their sides. A former member of the special team recalled in 1995 his first vivisection conducted at the unit. He didn't struggle when they led him into the room and tied him down. But when I picked up the scalpel, that's when he began screaming. I cut him open from the chest to the stomach, and he screamed terribly, and his face was all twisted in agony. He made this unimaginable sound, he was screaming so horribly. But then finally he stopped. This was all in a day's work for the surgeons, but it really left an impression on me because it was my first time. Other sources suggest that it was the usual practice in the unit for surgeons to stuff a rag into the mouth of prisoners before commencing vivisection in order to stifle any screaming. Despite the prison's status as a highly secure building, at least one unsuccessful escape attempt did occur. Corporal Kikuchi Norimitsu testified that he was told by another unit member that a prisoner had shown violence and had struck the experimenter with a door handle and then jumped out of the cell and ran down the corridor, seized the keys and opened the iron doors and some of the cells. Some of the prisoners managed to jump out, but these were only the bold ones. These bold ones were shot. Seiichi Morimura in his book The Devil's Feast went into some greater detail regarding this escape attempt. 2 Russian male prisoners were in a cell with handcuffs on, one of them lay flat on the floor pretending to be sick. This got the attention of a staff member who saw it as an unusual condition. That staff member decided to enter the cell. The Russian lying on the floor suddenly sprang up and knocked the guard down. The 2 Russians opened their handcuffs, took the keys, and opened some other cells while yelling. Some prisoners, including Russian and Chinese, were frantically roaming the corridors and kept yelling and shouting. One Russian shouted to the members of Unit 731, demanding to be shot rather than used as an experimental object. This Russian was shot to death. One staff member, who was an eyewitness at this escape attempt, recalled, "Spiritually we were all lost in front of the Meridas who had no freedom and no weapons. At that time we understood in our hearts that justice was not on our side. Unfortunately for the prisoners of Unit 731, escape was an impossibility. Even if they had managed to escape the quadrangle, they would have had to get over a 3-meter-high brick wall surrounding the complex, and then across a dry moat filled with electrified wire running around the perimeter of the complex. Members of Unit 731 were not immune from being subjects of experiments. Yojiro Tamura, an assistant in the special team, recalled that Yojiro Sud, an employee of the 1st Division at Unit 731, became infected with bubonic plague as a result of the production of plague bacteria. The special team was then ordered to vivisect Sud. Tamura recalled. Sud had, a few days previously, been interested in talking about women, but now he was thin as a rake, with many purple spots over his body. A large area of scratches on his chest were bleeding. He painfully cried and breathed with difficulty. I sanitized his whole body with disinfectant. Whenever he moved, a rope around his neck tightened. After Sud's body was carefully checked, I handed a scalpel to Hu, reversely gripping the scalpel, touched Sud's stomach skin and sliced downward. Sud shouted "brute," and died with this last word. Additionally, Unit 731 Youth Corps member Yojiro Shinozuka testified that his friend Junior Assistant Mitsuo Hirakawa was vivisected as a result of being accidentally infected with plague. Known unit members. There are unit members who were known to be interned at the Fushun War Criminals Management Center and Taiyuan War Criminals Management Center after the war, who then went on to be repatriated to Japan and founded the Association of Returnees from China and testified about Unit 731 and the crimes perpetrated there. Some members included Yojiro Shinozuka, Yasuji Kaneko, Tadayuki Furumi, Shigeru Fujita. Ken Yuasa. In April 2018, the National Archives of Japan disclosed a nearly complete list of 3,607 members of Unit 731 to Katsuo Nishiyama, a professor at Shiga University of Medical Science. Nishiyama reportedly intended to publish the list online to encourage further study into the unit. Previously disclosed members included Lieutenant General Shir Ishii, Lieutenant Colonel Ryoichi Nato, founder of the pharmaceutical company Green Cross. Professor, Major General Masaji Kitano, Commander, 1942–1945, 137. Yojiro Shinozuka, Yasuji Kaneko, Kazuhisa Kanazawa, Chief of the 1st Division of Branch 673 of Unit 731. Ryoichiro Hata, member of the High-Lar branch of Unit 731. Shigeo Ozaki, civilian employee, 243. Kyoyoshi Minioi, civilian employee, 243. Masateru Sato, civilian employee, 243. Major General Hitashi Kikuchi, head of Research Division, 1942–1945, 133. Lieutenant General Yazazaka, Doctor, 241. Yoshio Furyuaki, student at Sunya branch of Unit 731, 243. There were also 12 members who were formally tried and sentenced in the Khabarovsk war crime trials. Other suspected Japanese war criminals who were never indicted include 3 post-war prime ministers, Hatoyama Ichiro, Kishi Nobusuke, and Ikeda Hayato. Divisions. Unit 731 was divided into 8 divisions. Division 1, Research on bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, and tuberculosis using live human subjects. For this purpose, a prison was constructed to contain around 300 to 400 people. Division 2, Research for biological weapons used in the field, in particular the production of devices to spread germs and parasites. Division 3, production of shells containing biological agents, stationed in Harbin. Division 4, bacteria mass production and storage. Division 5, training of personnel. Division 6-8, equipment, medical, and administrative units. Facilities. Unit 731 had other units underneath it in the chain of command. There were several other units under the auspice of Japan's biological weapons programs. Most or all units had branch offices, which were also often referred to as units. The term Unit 731 can refer to the Harbin complex itself, or it can refer to the organization and its branches, subunits, and their branches. The Unit 731 complex covered 6 square kilometers and consisted of more than 150 buildings. The design of the facilities made them hard to destroy by bombing. The complex contained various factories. It had around 4,500 containers to be used to raise fleas, 6 cauldrons to produce various chemicals, and around 1,800 containers to produce biological agents. Approximately 30 kilograms of bubonic plague bacteria could be produced in a few days. Some of Unit 731's satellite facilities are still in use by various Chinese industrial companies. A portion has been preserved and is open to visitors as a war crimes museum. Branches. Unit 731 had branches in Lingkou, Mudanjiang, Hailan, Sunwu, Tone, and Hailar, 60, 84, 124, 310. Tokyo. A medical school and research facility belonging to Unit 731 operated in the Shinjuku district of Tokyo during World War II. In 2006, Toyo Ishii, a nurse who worked at the school during the war, revealed that she had helped bury bodies and pieces of bodies on the school's grounds shortly after Japan's surrender in 1945. In response, in February 2011 the Ministry of Health began to excavate the site. While Tokyo courts acknowledged in 2002 that Unit 731 has been involved in biological warfare research, as of 2011 the Japanese government had made no official acknowledgement of the atrocities committed against test subjects and rejected the Chinese government's requests for DNA samples to identify human remains found near an army medical school. At Tokyo's Kyushu Imperial University in 1945, U.S. POWs from a shot-down B-29 were subjected to fatal medical experimentation. Surrender and immunity. Operations and experiments continued until the end of the war. Ishii had wanted to use biological weapons in the Pacific War since May 1944, but his attempts were repeatedly snubbed. Destruction of evidence. With the coming of the Red Army in August 1945, the unit had to abandon their work in haste. Ministries in Tokyo ordered the destruction of all incriminating materials, including those in Pingfang. Potential witnesses, such as the 300 remaining prisoners, were either gassed or fed poison, while the 600 Chinese and Manchurian laborers were shot. Ishii ordered every member of the group to disappear and take the secret to the grave. Potassium cyanide vials were issued for use in case the remaining personnel were captured. Skeleton crews of Ishii's Japanese troops blew up the compound in the final days of the war to destroy evidence of their activities, but many were sturdy enough to remain somewhat intact. American grant of immunity. Among the individuals in Japan after its 1945 surrender was Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, who arrived in Yokohama via the American ship Sturgis in September 1945. Sanders was a highly regarded microbiologist and a member of America's Military Center for Biological Weapons. Sanders' duty was to investigate Japanese biological warfare activity. At the time of his arrival in Japan, he had no knowledge of what Unit 731 was. Until Sanders finally threatened the Japanese with bringing the Soviets into the picture, little information about biological warfare was being shared with the Americans. The Japanese wanted to avoid prosecution under the Soviet legal system, so, the morning after he made his threat, Sanders received a manuscript describing Japan's involvement in biological warfare. Sanders took this information to General Douglas MacArthur, who was the supreme commander of the Allied powers and responsible for rebuilding Japan during the Allied occupations. MacArthur struck a deal with Japanese informants. He secretly granted immunity to the physicians of Unit 731, including their leader, in exchange for providing America, but not the other wartime allies, with their research on biological warfare and data from human experimentation. American occupation authorities monitored the activities of former unit members, including reading and censoring their mail. The Americans believed that the research data was valuable and did not want other nations, particularly the Soviet Union, to acquire data on biological weapons. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal heard only one reference to Japanese experiments with poisonous serums on Chinese civilians. This took place in August 1946 and was instigated by David Sutton, assistant to the Chinese prosecutor. The Japanese Defense Council argued that the claim was vague and uncorroborated, and it was dismissed by the tribunal president, Sir William Webb, for lack of evidence. The subject was not pursued further by Sutton, who was probably unaware of Unit 731's activities. His reference to it at the trial is believed to have been accidental. While German physicians were brought to trial and had their crimes publicized, the U.S. concealed information about Japanese biological warfare experiments and secured immunity for the perpetrators. Critics argue that racism led to the double standard in the American post-war responses to the experiments conducted on different nationalities. Whereas the perpetrators of Unit 731 were exempt from prosecution, the U.S. held a tribunal in Yokohama in 1948 that indicted 9 Japanese physician professors and medical students for conducting vivisection upon captured American pilots. 2 professors were sentenced to death and others to 15-20 years imprisonment. Separate Soviet trials. Although publicly silent on the issue at the Tokyo trials, the Soviet Union pursued the case and prosecuted 12 top military leaders and scientists from Unit 731 and its affiliated biological war prisons, Unit 1644 in Nanjing and Unit 100 in Chongchun, in the Khabarovsk war crimes trials. Among those accused of war crimes, including germ warfare, was General Otaz Yamada, Commander-in-Chief of the million-man Guandong Army occupying Manchuria. The trial of the Japanese perpetrators was held in Khabarovsk in December 1949. A lengthy partial transcript of trial proceedings was published in different languages the following year by the Moscow Foreign Languages Press, including an English-language edition. The lead prosecuting attorney at the Khabarovsk trial was Lev Smirnov, who had been one of the top Soviet prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials. The Japanese doctors and army commanders who had perpetrated the Unit 731 experiments received sentences from the Khabarovsk court ranging from 2 to 25 years in a Siberian labor camp. The United States refused to acknowledge the trials, branding them communist propaganda. The sentences doled out to the Japanese perpetrators were unusually lenient by Soviet standards, and all but 2 of the defendants returned to Japan by the 1950s. In addition to the accusations of propaganda, the U.S. also asserted that the trials were to only serve as a distraction from the Soviet treatment of several 100,000 Japanese prisoners of war. Meanwhile, the USSR asserted that the U.S. had given the Japanese diplomatic leniency in exchange for information regarding their human experimentation. The accusations of both the US and the USSR were true, and it is believed that the Japanese had also given information to the Soviets regarding their biological experimentation for judicial leniency. This was evidenced by the Soviet Union building a biological weapons facility in Sverdlovsk using documentation captured from Unit 731 in Manchuria. Official silence during the American occupation of Japan. As above, During the United States occupation of Japan, the members of Unit 731 and the members of other experimental units were allowed to go free. On May 6, 1947, Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, wrote to Washington in order to inform it that additional data, possibly some statements from Ishii, can probably be obtained by informing Japanese involved that information will be retained in intelligence channels and will not be employed as war crimes evidence. 1 Graduate of Unit 1644, Masami Kintaka, continued to perform experiments on unwilling Japanese subjects from 1947 to 1956. He performed his experiments while he was working for Japan's National Institute of Health Sciences. He infected prisoners with rickettsia and infected mentally ill patients with typhus. As the chief of the unit, Shiro Ishii was granted immunity from prosecution for war crimes by the American occupation authorities, because he had provided human experimentation research materials to them. From 1948 to 1958, less than 5% of the documents were transferred onto microfilm and stored in the U.S. National Archives before they were shipped back to Japan. Post-occupation Japanese media coverage and debate. Japanese discussions of Unit 731's activity began in the 1950s, after the end of the American occupation of Japan. In 1952, human experiments carried out in Nagoya City Pediatric Hospital, which resulted in one death, were publicly tied to former members of Unit 731. Later in that decade, journalists suspected that the murders attributed by the government to Sadamichi Hirasawa were actually carried out by members of Unit 731. In 1958, Japanese author Seikou Endo published the book The Sea and Poison about human experimentation in Fukuoka, which is thought to have been based on a real incident. The author Seiichi Morimura published The Devil's Gluttony in 1981, followed by The Devil's Gluttony, a sequel in 1983. These books purported to reveal the true operations of Unit 731, but falsely attributed unrelated photos to the unit, which raised questions about their accuracy. Also in 1981, the first direct testimony of human vivisection in China was given by Ken Yuasa. Since then, much more in-depth testimony has been given in Japan. The 2001 documentary Japanese Devils largely consists of interviews with 14 Unit 731 staff members taken prisoner by China and later released. Significance in post-war research on biowarfare and medicine. Japanese biological warfare operations were by far the largest during World War II, and possibly with more people and resources than the BW-producing nations of France, Hungary, Italy, Poland, and the Soviet Union combined, between the world wars. Although the dissemination methods of delivering plague-infected fleas by aircraft were crude, the method, among others, allowed the Japanese to conduct the most extensive employment of biological weapons during World War II. However, the amount of effort devoted to BW was not matched by its results. Ultimately, inadequate scientific and engineering foundations limited the effectiveness of the Japanese program. Harris speculates that U.S. scientists generally wanted to acquire it due to the concept of forbidden fruit, believing that lawful and ethical prohibitions could affect the outcomes of their research. Official government response in Japan. Unit 731 presents a special problem since, unlike Nazi human experimentation, which the United States publicly condemned, the activities of Unit 731 are known to the general public only from the testimonies of willing former unit members. Japanese history textbooks usually contain references to Unit 731, but do not go into detail about allegations, in accordance with this principle. Saber Inaga's New History of Japan included a detailed description, based on officers' testimony. The Ministry for Education attempted to remove this passage from his textbook before it was taught in public schools, on the basis that the testimony was insufficient. The Supreme Court of Japan ruled in 1997 that the testimony was indeed sufficient and that requiring it to be removed was an illegal violation of freedom of speech. In 1997, international lawyer Tsuchiya filed a class action suit against the Japanese government, demanding reparations for the actions of Unit 731, using evidence filed by Professor Makoto Ueda of Rikkyo University. All levels of the Japanese court system found the suit baseless. No findings of fact were made about the existence of human experimentation, but the court's ruling was that reparations are determined by international treaties, not national courts. In August 2002, the Tokyo District Court ruled for the first time that Japan had engaged in biological warfare. Presiding Judge Koji Iwata ruled that Unit 731, on the orders of the Imperial Japanese Army headquarters, used bacteriological weapons on Chinese civilians between 1940 and 1942, spreading diseases, including plague and typhoid, in the cities of Kuzhou, Ningbo, and Changde. However, he rejected victims' compensation claims on the grounds that they had already been settled by international peace treaties. In October 2003, a member of Japan's House of Representatives filed an inquiry. Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi responded that the Japanese government did not then possess any records related to Unit 731, but recognized the gravity of the matter and would publicize any records located in the future. In April 2018, the National Archives of Japan released the names of 3,607 members of Unit 731, in response to a request by Professor Katsuo Nishiyama of the Shiga University of Medical Science. Abroad. After World War II, the Office of Special Investigations created a watch list of suspected Axis collaborators and persecutors who are banned from entering the United States. While they have added over 60,000 names to the watch list, they have only been able to identify under 100 Japanese participants. In a 1998 correspondence letter between the DOJ and Rabbi Abraham Cooper, Eli Rosenbaum, director of OSI, stated that this was due to two factors. While most documents captured by the US and Europe were microfilmed before being returned to their respective governments, the Department of Defense decided to not microfilm its vast collection of documents before returning them to the Japanese government. The Japanese government has also failed to grant the OSI meaningful access to these and related records after the war, while European countries, on the other hand, have been largely cooperative, the cumulative effect of which is that information pertaining to identifying these individuals is, in effect, impossible to recover. In popular culture. Print media. The Narrow Road to the Deep North, a Booker Prize-winning 2014 novel by Australian writer Richard Flanagan, refers extensively to the atrocities committed by a doctor who served in Unit 731. Forest Sea, a novel by a Polish writer and educator Igor Newurly, was the first book published outside Asia which refers to atrocities committed in the unit. The Man Who Ended History, a documentary, a novella published in the Paper Menagerie book by American writer and Chinese translator Ken Liu, a scientific discovery allows a victim's descendant to go back in time to witness and learn the truth about the atrocities committed in the unit. Tricky 22, a novel in the Stephanie Plum series by Janet Ivanovich, features as its antagonist a deranged biology professor who is obsessed with Unit 731 and is attempting to recreate the unit's bubonic plague dispersals. The Solomon Curse, a novel in the Fargo Adventures series by Clive Cussler and Russell Blake, involves this unit in its plot, around secret human experimentation on the island of Guadalcanal. The Grim Noir series, an alternative history series of novels by Larry Correia, has Unit 731 conducting brutal magical experiments on prisoners of the Japanese Imperium. Setting Sun story from Hellblazer No. 142 by DC Comics, written by Warren Ellis and illustrated by Javier Pulido, features a fictitious character who used to be a doctor in Unit 731 during the war and conducted experiments on humans. In the manga My Hero Academia, a mad scientist who conducts experiments on humans to create a genetically modified race was first introduced as Shiga Merida. Because of the association with the Merida project, it caused a major controversy, especially in China, where Tencent and Bilibili removed the manga from their platforms. Both Weekly Shonen Jump magazine and the author Kei Horikoshi issued individual apologizing statements on Twitter, and the character name was changed in subsequent publications. Crisis in the Ashes, by William W. Johnstone, features the grandson of Dr. Ishii who has samples of the bubonic plague that he is trying to use to stop the liberal dictator of the USA from using to conduct ethnic cleansing. Occupied City, a novel by British author David Peace who lives in Japan, presents a mystery about a murder on January 26, 1948 in Tokyo. A murderer poisons bank employees by pretending to be a government official administering a dysentery vaccine. Gradually, through the testimonies of various people connected to the tragedy, it becomes clear that the poisoner has a shared history with Unit 731. Films. There have been several films about the atrocities of Unit 731. Through Gobi and Shingon, co-production of USSR, Mongolia, Eastern Germany. Miniseries. The Sea and Poison, Japan, directed by Kei Kyumei. Men Behind the Sun, China, directed by Tun Fei Mao. Unit 731, Laboratory of the Devil, China, directed by Godfrey Ho. Kazoo, France, directed by Serge Violet. 731, Two Versions of Hell, produced by James T. Hong, documentary about Unit 731 told from the Chinese and Japanese sides. Philosophy of a Knife, Russia, directed by Andrei Iskanov. Dead Mine, Indonesia, directed by Stephen Scheil and based in a fictionalized version of Unit 731. Dongju, The Portrait of a Poet, South Korea, directed by Lee Junik, depicts dead poet Yoon Dongju. Wife of a Spy, Japan, directed by Kiyoshi Kurosawa and won the Silver Lion for Best Direction at the Venice Film Festival in 2020. Music. The Breeding House, Bruce Dickinson. Segment of the CD single Tears of the Dragon, describing the atrocities committed by Unit 731 and the immunity granted by the Americans to the physicians of the unit. Unit 731, American thrash metal band Slayer. Song on the album World Painted Blood, describing the events and atrocities that occurred at Unit 731. Unit 731, Power electronic band Brand Commando. And You Will Beg for Our Secrets, from the Anal Nathrock album The Whole of the Law, refers to Unit 731's activities and the U.S. amnesty given in exchange for information resulting from the experiments carried out. The New Eternity, from the Silent Planet album When the End Began, refers to Unit 731's human experimentation and other crimes against humanity. Merida, South Korean metal band Sad Legend. Television. Unit 731 Did the Emperor Know? Television South documentary made in 1985 and first broadcast on the August 13. The X-Files episode 731. Former members of Unit 731 secretly continue their experiments on humans under control of a covert U.S. government agency. Regenesis episode Let It Burn. Outbreaks of anthrax and glanders are traced to World War II Japan. Warehouse 13 episode The 40th Floor. General Shir Ishii's medal from Unit 731 simulated drowning when applied to a victim's skin. Concrete Revolutio. The experimentation on superhumans by the Japanese and Americans is a parallel to Unit 731. 731. A 5-episode CCTV documentary broadcast in 2015. The Truth of Unit 731, Elite Medical Students and Human Experiments. An NHK documentary broadcast in 2017, including paper materials, recording tapes, and interviews to former members and doctors who have implemented experiments in Unit 731. In the Blacklist, the episode General Shiro is a reference to Shir Ishii. Linked to part of a recorded telephone interview with Yoshimura Hisato. Kamen Rider Black Sun, a 10-episode Amazon Prime Video reboot of the original Kamen Rider Black in Japan. The Kaijin experiments is similar to Unit 731. Downamai Mikanashuk began the experiments in 1936. The title is written on the document. It was also in 1936 that Nobusuke Kishi got the title of In Manchuria, China. Video games. In Call of Duty, Black Ops 3, the Zombies map included in the second DLC pack, Zetsubo no Shima, is loosely inspired by Unit 731. In the indie horror game Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion, the Unit 731 experiments are explicitly referenced multiple times in terms of Specimen 9, as well as the labeling of human bodies as logs. I'm taking all those logs they keep throwing out, and I'm nailing them together. See also Unit 100, Unit 516, Unit 543, Unit 1644, Unit 1855, Unit 8604, Unit 9420. Allied war crimes during World War II. American cover-up of Japanese war crimes. British war crimes. Comfort women. German war crimes. History of biological warfare. History of chemical warfare. Human subject research. Italian war crimes. Japanese war crimes. List of Axis personnel indicted for war crimes. Nobusuke Kishi. Operation Bloodstone. Operation Paperclip. Project Mneamai. Ratlins. Soviet war crimes. Kunoshima. Unethical human experimentation. United States war crimes. War crime. War crimes in Manchukuo. War crimes of the Wehrmacht. Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. Chang'e chemical weapon attack. Kaimingja germ weapon attack. Second Sino-Japanese War. Pacific War. Other human experimentation. Gouda chemical attack. Halabja massacre. Human experimentation in North Korea. Joseph Mengele. Nazi human experimentation. Poison laboratory of the Soviet Secret Services. Project Coast. Unethical human experimentation in the United States.